Good morning, everybody. I'm Rachel Frick. I'm the director of the Digital Library Federation program at the Council on Library and Information Resources, DLF at CLIR. So thank you for coming out to the 2011 DLF Forum. I just want to say really quickly that when we did the call for proposals, it was really gratifying to get such a strong call. It was a lot of hard work for the program planning committee, and doing the online voting tool was a new one for us, but I think it worked out really well. But what was really great is that we saw these 4 themes come out from the proposals. And they seem to cluster around libraries and publishing, data stewardship, or if we want to call it data curation, data management. I think there's a presentation on trying to disambiguate some of our terms there. There was a little bit about the Digital Public Library of America, which I think is this nice emergent frame that we can all work towards. And there's some presentations later on today about that. And there was an awful lot of talk about linked open data. And this year was definitely the year of linked open data, especially the summer. We were calling it the summer of linked open data because it seemed like every week there was yet another conversation about linked open data. And that's how I got to meet our keynote speaker, David Weinberger. It was through some of these meetings with DPLA and linked open data. And I was just so impressed with how enthusiastic and inquiring and genuinely curious David was when he came to the meeting, especially when we were at the International Summit on Linked Open Data for Libraries, Archives, and Museums that was hosted by Chris Carpenter and John Voss. I think John's here. And it just struck me how David was wanting just to talk to people, just open and honest, and wanted to learn as much as he could from everybody's individual experience, what their perspectives were, so he could better understand the issue and the situation. And it really inspired me to go back and do what I could to help facilitate this linked open data conversation, because I think there were so many conversations happening. How can we cross these conversation streams? How can we make sure that communities were not trying to rework the wheel, but how can we group these people together so we can move the whole cart forward, as we like to say. So on that note, I'd like to welcome David Weinberger this morning as our opening keynote speaker for the 2011 DLF Forum. Thank you.
Well, that was one of the nicest introductions I've ever had, but no surprise coming from Rachel. It was one of the great pleasures of the Digital Public Library, or DPLA. I got tired of saying DPLA, that's too long, so DIPLA. One of the great pleasures of DIPLA has been the set of people who have come together around it, and some of us have been on the circuit at the various DIPLA and linked open data meetings, and it's wonderful to have found myself in this group. So let me recast your introduction, if you don't mind. I met David. He knew nothing. He was really ignorant, and so I invited him to talk to a room full of experts. And so the best thing I can do, I think, is offer maybe a framing of stuff you already know and hope that there's something in that. So I want to talk today about a change in our cultural understanding of knowledge, and in fact in the structure of knowledge as well. And at the end, I have like 2 slides, really brief, about how this might apply to the DPLA. Oh, and I'm plugging a book. Sorry, it comes out in January. That's there to remind me to. And the book. Okay, so now we can move on. So right from the very beginning of the age of information, we've been worried about information overload. In fact, this is the movie's desk set, of course, and that points at the information overload. In fact, the end of there's a great throwing up of paper, it's spewing out. And we've been worried about this since the very beginning of the information age. In fact, I think it's reasonable to say that information itself was invented in order to manage the overflow of information. So that in the information age, in the computer age, we rightly worried, we rebelled. Do not fold, spindle, mutilate. I don't know if you're old enough to remember that, but the resistance against computers was real and was based on something real, namely that computers were, in fact, in order to be able to manage this stuff called information, they had to reduce the amount of it into some number of rows and columns, and then we take care of it. But the fundamental step is to reduce the amount. It's always been about fearing too much information. So this person today in the modern world is much more like this and completely overflowing with information. This wild bottom-up, it's not top-down creation of columns, it's all bottom-up and it's endless. It's as much as we possibly can. It all points to something else. And so, yeah, we are more concerned than ever about information overload. And in fact, Clay Shirky has reminded us that while we are terribly concerned about it, so you're probably all familiar with this wonderful phrase from Clay, and those of you in this corner who can't see the slides, it says, Clay says, there's no such thing as information overload, there's only filter failure, which is a really, really smart remark. No surprise coming from Clay Shirky, who's really, really smart. So Shirky says this in order to take some of the edge off, that we should not panic. It's okay, we've always had this problem, and we know how to solve it. It's to fix the filters. So he's pointed to some historical continuity, which I think is very valuable, and there's sort of now a standard paragraph in all commentary about information overload that points back to the sources around the time of Gutenberg that talked about information overload. In fact, there's a wonderful line from Seneca about too many books. So yes, continuity, but there's also discontinuity. So while I really love this, this statement of Shirky's, I want to actually shade two aspects of it. And the first is to point to there's also some discontinuity. So if you look at the origin of the phrase itself, it was popularized by Toffler in his 1970 bestseller, huge bestseller, and actually a book that holds up pretty well. This is a good book. He's the one who first really brought this to consciousness, to public consciousness. The term started around 1960s, and it built upon, and quite explicitly, Toffler's very explicit about this, it builds upon a prior term, which had arisen in the 1950s, of sensory overload. And the idea of sensory overload was, as you know, that if you go to, say, a Grateful Dead concert and there's all the noise and the smells and the people and the touch, and that it's possible that your senses will get overloaded and you will fall down as a gibbering idiot frothing at the mouth and twitching. But this will have very physiological individual effect. And so this idea of sensory overload gained popularity in the 50s and especially in the 60s as a way of frightening parents about their children's drug use. That's very direct. That's why we started talking about sensory overload. Then there's information, the concept of information, which was invented in 1948, because I don't believe in the continuity of information across all of time. It started in 1948 when the term was taken over by Claude Shannon. And as it swept through the culture for really mysterious and interesting reasons, we came up with the idea of, well, the mind is not just a sensory processor, it's also an information processor. A really crucial step in our culture. The notion that this thing that we had invented for computers in order to limit the amount of stuff that's going in so that we could manage it, we've now reformulated our idea of how consciousness works. So since we are now information processors, then there should be such a thing as information overload, just as there's sensory overload. And so we get the idea of information overload. And the idea of it was, again, and Toffler says this, that sanity itself hangs upon this. That is, if your brain, the information processor, whatever that means, I would argue that we actually have no idea what that means, but the brain is an information processor, too much information, it's an individual psychological effect. You will fall down gibbering. You will be twitching and gibbering and foaming just as you did with sensory. Right? So it's an individual psychological thing that we were worried about back then. So what did information overload look like back then? Well, Toffler, 1970. By 1974, an influential paper was published by marketers, academic marketers doing research. And the question was, what constitutes information overload? So they did a study. They gathered 192 housewives, and they gave them 16 different brands, each with 16 different sorts of categories on it. And the categories were simplified, so it wasn't even 120 calories. It was simply low cal, high cal. That was it. And the marketers discovered that the housewives' cognitive abilities went down when confronted with this much information, 16 brands, 16 yes-no categories. That was information overload in 1974. We look at this and we laugh in the face of this information. This is nothing. Are you kidding me? This is information. Well, yes, that is what information overload was. And the marketers, of course, took this research to mean that it was in the interest of the housewives, those poor gibbering housewives, to withhold information from them. Don't give them those 16 different categories. That's way too much information on the label. It was in their own interest. This is what information overload looked like. However, as our idea of what the overload consists of has expanded, the very notion of information overload also has changed. So that rather than it being something that drives you as an individual crazy, we worry much, when people now complain about information overload, they're not saying, I'm about to become a twitching mass. What they're saying is, I'm not getting enough information. I'm not getting the right information. I need to be able to navigate the sea. It's not that it's become simply the cultural landscape, not an individual psychological syndrome. So that's the first little disagreement with Shirky on this. He's right to point to the continuity, but there's also a discontinuity. So these are pretty gentle disagreements. And the second is not so much a disagreement as an expansion, which is to say that, yeah, filter failure, and we are constantly working on our filters, and that's where much of the progress in the past 15 years has been. It's been amazing. Anybody who is an IR before the web can attest to the amazing progress we've made on filtering. But the nature of the filters has changed. IR, I don't think people use anymore. It does not mean infrared, it means information retrieval. Okay, sorry. So the nature of the filters themselves, different now, different in a networked digital world. So that if a library in the old days, a purely physical library, if you're on the acquisitions committee, you make decisions about what's coming in, and you are, people see what you've acquired, because you put them on the new bookshelf, everybody's very excited, but what people do not see, what your users don't see, are the sort of metaphorical truckloads of books, of all the rejected books, gradually, slowly backing away from the loading bay in shame. They don't have a sense of the wash of books that you had to consider before you picked the tiny handful that you're able to afford and have space for. But it's different online. So that if I filter online now, I don't so much separate into two piles and discard and hide the other pile, put it out of the way or throw it away. Rather, I'm just bringing some things a few clicks closer. So if I publish a post on my blog, the top 10 DPLA commentaries or whatever, and I have them there, all I'm doing is making it much easier for you to click on those 10. I've shortened the number of clicks that it takes you to get to Rachel's post or Martin's post, or that's all I've done. And all the other posts are still sitting there, and you can still find them. There's no problem finding them. You just Google for them, or somebody else has a different top 10 list, or they're still there. And so filtering on the net is much different. It does not remove items. It simply shortens the distance to some of them. And as a result, we have a sense now we have some sense of the genuine expanse of information. And if we didn't, the search engines are very happy to tell us, because it's in their economic interest to impress us, that coming up with this search, actually there were 3 million results. And if you did it in 0.19 seconds. So we are much more aware than we ever were, because of the nature of filters has changed. The illusion of filters has changed. We're much more aware of the extent of what there is to know. Well, this is a change, because we've had a strategy for knowing our world in the West for 2,500 years at least. This is a strategy that is adapted to the most basic fact, which is, skulls don't scale. The world's way bigger than what any one person can know. And so we've had to come up with strategies. And our fundamental strategy in the West has been to reduce what there is to know. That's how we have succeeded. So, for example, one important technique is to allow people to break off a brain-sized chunk of the world and to know it thoroughly, and we call those people experts. The domain is the size of what fits in a human brain, or a very large human brain. And this is obviously a hugely valuable thing to do. It allows us, for example, to have a question or something we want to know, and we can go to an expert, whether it's somebody on TV or it's a book that we read or it's a professor or whatever it is, and we can ask. And because that person is an expert, we get an answer, we can stop asking. That's the crucial thing. We can stop. Once the expert has said, oh, no, the atomic weight of carbon is 12.01, I'm not sure that's right, I'm not an expert, we don't have to then do the experiment in our backyard because we looked it up. We looked it up in a credentialed source, and we are right to rely upon these sources. And credentialing itself is a series of stopping points. Why should I believe? Oh, I see. You have a doctorate in chemistry and you're at Oxford. Well, then I'm going to believe you on the atomic weight of carbon. Credentialing itself is a series of stopping points to back up, to support the stopping points that knowledge has been built around. We've constructed knowledge as a series of stopping points. This is hugely efficient. We've become the dominant species on the planet because of that. This is an incredibly efficient way of proceeding in a world that from the beginning has far outstripped our ability to know it. But it's not the way knowledge is. It's the way that knowledge is when paper is its medium. This is not an inherent property of knowledge. It's how paper works. Everybody here loves books. I'm not going to bother to say, oh, books are wonderful, books are wonderful. Nevertheless, books also suck. They suck at connectivity. They are a disconnected medium. And many of the properties of knowledge that we've taken as inherent in knowledge itself, as properties of knowledge itself, are in fact results of these limitations of paper that we've taken as natural. We've so inhabited it that we think this is how knowledge is. If you want to connect two things in a book, you put in a footnote. But we all know that very few people ever follow any footnotes, and nobody follows all the footnotes except in the most unusual circumstances. The footnotes are there as stopping points to reassure us that, in fact, there is some, what? It says the atomic weight is 12.01? That can't be right. Oh, I see, they got it from. It's a stopping point of inquiry. Very rarely do we go and check the source because you have to hop on a bus, get to a major city, find the library, hope that the book is in, and it's not. We don't do it. It's hugely inefficient to chase down footnotes, except in very special circumstances. As a result of the disconnected medium that books are, authors try to get everything the reader needs into one volume. Because it's too hard to think the reader's going to go and check it. So we have an entire forms of rhetoric that are based around the limitations, the lack of connectivity of books. But now, of course, things are changing. I believe there is a D in DLF. And we can think about links as being as basic as being a new form of punctuation. Where most forms of punctuation tell you where to stop, links enable you to continue. With the smallest imaginable human movement, which is, millimeter movement of a finger, you're now in a new work. So it enables and encourages, it doesn't just point to these points of connectivity, it actually is the magic map that you touch and you go there. So great, we're in an age of connection. It's fabulous, it's wonderful. The cheap irony is that an age of hyperlink connection is also an age of everything falling apart. Everything gets disconnected because of hyperlinks. And the good side of this is that things assume a more, and I'm going to use the word natural and I'll defend it later, because they assume a more natural topology. Things that were held together simply because they had to be sewn into bindings don't need that anymore. So they fall into a shape that is more accurately reflects their nature. That's the good thing. But the bad thing is things fall apart, and inevitably we have to figure out how to put them together. It's my overall contention that knowledge now is taking, just as it took on properties of paper and of books and of ink that sinks into paper, it's now taking on properties of the network itself. And so I want to look at three of those properties, especially with regard to how we are trying to pull together that which has now fallen apart. And so the first property is messiness of knowledge, and obviously we're very good at putting things into categories. And in fact, we have since at least Aristotle thought that not only are these useful arrangements for retrieval, but the order of things, the single order of things, is an expression of what things in fact are. To know what something is, know that that's a bird, is to know where it is in this order, and it has been for, this is only, for 2,500 years it's been the challenge and destiny and fulfillment of humans and of human knowledge to figure out what that order is, to get that single order right. And that idea now has fallen away so rapidly in the past couple of decades that it's amazing. It's like the change from medieval idea of how things are put together by association, which now seems so foreign to us. The notion that Cancer and the Crab constellation have some real relationship because they sort of look alike. That idea from the Middle Ages is completely foreign to us. It seems crazy and stupid and wrong. And in the same way, very rapidly, but it took hundreds of years to move away from that. The notion that there is a single order that we're trying to put things into, that's been falling away very quickly. It's really sort of amazing. So we know that this group knows better than anybody what the problems with this way of thinking is, that there's a single spot which things are, that they are, or they're positioned in this order. Runs into trouble when you find things that don't fit very nicely into either of two categories, or when something fits into way too many categories, or when we just can't figure out, you got to look in the upper right there, when we just can't figure out what the categories are. So the way that we've been addressing this to a large degree, many possibilities opened by this new idea that a thing can be in many different categories at the same time, and that be useful, not just a mistake of classification. We didn't get it right, but it's a desideratum. It's great that it's in so many. One of the more important ways, changes in how we think about knowledge has been that we've gotten, in many instances, quite inclusive. When in doubt, include it. The cost of deleting is, or of curating, is way higher at this point in most cases than the cost of just including it, because you're just talking about hard drive space, and there's no technology in the world that's going down faster than the cost of storage. I understand there are other costs as well. Nevertheless, we are now seeing over and over again in multiple realms, everything from Flickr to data.gov, include it. Don't argue. Don't waste time and money, or just include it. In fact, there's a good reason to include everything. When you curate, you obviously are anticipating what the interests and needs and sort of cultural background of your users is going to be. So that if you were curating quite reasonably a news source, you would very likely have excluded Lindsay Lohan and Britney Spears sorts of news, and you'd be right to do so, but insofar as you did, you are now depriving these academics who are studying the role of the media with women celebrities, you would have deprived them of their primary news source. Likewise, in 1996, very few people would have thought that it's very important that we include the meetings, the notes in the library meetings of Wasilla, Alaska. That did not seem like something that should make it into the important news collection. But then in 2008, we had good reason to actually wish that we had included that. So we can't anticipate user interests. Nobody can. Right? Nobody can. Humans are just too squirrely. We don't know what people are going to be interested in. We cannot successfully anticipate all of those uses, those interests, nor can we anticipate history. Inclusiveness gets us past both of those problems. It has some other problems, and if you're going to have an inclusive collection, then you need to provide people with ways of filtering on the way out so that they can choose at any moment how they're going to go through it. And that's what many of you have been working on. This brings about a change in metadata. And first of all, I want to say how happy I am that I do not have to explain what metadata is. You see, when two pieces of information fall in love, so I don't have to do that. That's very nice for me. The notion of metadata has also changed under our noses. And again, you're all familiar with this, but I actually want to remind you what metadata was only a couple of years ago. So metadata used to be, you know the author's name, and so you can use that as metadata to find out what was that book that he wrote, I can't remember. But once you start getting back not just the name of the book, but the contents of the book, as the content goes online, then you can take any piece of the content and you can use that as metadata. And what you will get back is the entire work, you'll get back the author. In fact, you'll get back, at this point, everything You'll get back biography, bibliography. You'll get back a photo of his house, of Melville's house in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and his social network, Hawthorne, and the map to the Hawthorne's house and the time they went up Monument Mountain and had a picnic and nobody knows what they talked about. You'll get back the biology of the whale. You'll get back Al Gore. You'll get everything. Because it turns out everything is linked. And what this means is that the old idea that metadata is something apart from data, that we have data and then we add the metadata, and those two things, and you use the metadata to find, that no longer holds because we can use anything to find anything else. And so there is no difference between metadata and data except an operational one. That is, metadata is the thing that you know, and data is the thing you don't know and you're looking for. That's it. That's the only difference. Everything can be metadata for everything else. It's actually wonderful news for our culture because metadata is the lever by which we pry up new knowledge. And if everything is metadata, we just got way, way smarter. The next property of knowledge that I think changes and that reflects network properties as well is that it falls apart, and it falls apart into differing camps that do not agree with one another. So this quote keeps showing up more and more from Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Everyone is entitled to his own opinion, not his own facts, which really is like comfort food. It makes us feel really good inside because it promises, there's a promise there. And the promise is that, yes, all the yammering and all the gibbering, especially those people who disagree with us, we get the facts out. And then either everybody agrees or we can just tell those other people to shut up and go away because they're not talking about facts. It's a very comforting idea. We can all agree after all. This is so fully in line with our traditional notion of knowledge, which has been about settling things. In fact, in terms of ordinary usage, you cannot say, I don't know which is right, but I know which is right. I mean, you have to, a knowledge claim excludes that which is not that knowledge claim. Right? Knowledge, we only say we know something when reasonable disagreement and doubt has been driven out or, put in political terms, has been marginalized. Because the claim of what's reasonable is, of course, itself a difficult question. So, knowledge has been about settling things just as books have been, just as ink dries on a page and soaks in and is there forever, becomes part of the page. Same with knowledge. It is settled. Knowledge is settled. And the process, the program, the project of knowledge for our species has been to settle things. That's how we've thought about it. There's many things we don't understand. One by one, we pick them off, we settle it, and we move on. That's been our model of knowledge. That's how books work. The net, in particular the web, is different. It is, in fact, all about difference. Every time you put in a link, you're linking to something that is in some way different from you, often in very slight ways. It supports what you say. It is a different expression of it. You find it funny. You think that it's ridiculous. And in every case, just about, on the web, you explain why you're putting the link in and what the relationship is. You say, you got to go see this site. It's hilarious. You'll thank me that I sent you there. Or you have to go see, I can't believe how stupid this person is. This epitomizes everything that's wrong with fill in the blank, and you point somebody there. You explain what the relationship is. But the thing that you don't do is point to a page that is exactly a carbon copy of yours because there's no point in it. Linking is all about pulling together a web through differences. All the different sorts of differences that humans are capable of. So it's not just a matter of the web being about differences, it's that these differences are linked. They're not excluded. That link is there threading things together. One result of this is that there's a common commentary about the net, that it's making us stupid. I can't believe all the idiots on the web. It's hopeless. There are so many. I can't believe what some people believe. All the sorts of things that one reads, especially, and that we all feel at some point, depending on which set of comments, which page you're on and what the comments are like. We all feel this at some point, and some have turned this into this is all that the net is. This is how they characterize the net. And from my point of view, I mean, this certainly is true. All these things are true. But the net is in fact exposing a truth that we've all known, but we didn't have to look at so often, which is we don't agree about anything. There is nothing, and I think this is probably pretty much literally true, there is nothing that is undisputed on the web. Whatever you say, 2 + 2 = 4, you're going to find somebody who denies that. There will be somebody there. So We don't agree about anything. We never did, but now we can see that. And we never will agree about anything. And my evidence for this is all of human history. We are not ever going to agree about anything. Now, let me be clear. I like facts. I like science. I'm not saying we should throw up our hands and run away because there's some idiot in some corner of the universe who's not going to believe us. All I'm saying is, no, we absolutely should pursue this. All that I'm saying is, as an empirical fact, we now see every day in front of us the fact that we don't agree about anything. It's not that everybody's right, but we don't all agree. In fact, this beloved quote from this beloved senator, it's not even clear that he ever said it. This is an unattributed quote. So how do we manage in a world where everybody disagrees? Well, we're coming up with wonderful techniques. I'm going to point very, very quickly to two, because you know both of them. One is linked data. Right? Linked data allows people who explain things differently, talk about things differently, through the magic of links, to point to authorities that are the same, so that when or more important, when computers come along, they can understand that, in fact, oh yeah, that's the Emperor Concerto, that's that one, where you point at a that. It's a brilliant, brilliant technique for allowing multiple descriptions and multiple ways of thinking about things within a world that is linked and thus shared. So we can at least start making sense of one another. And the other is very closely related, but I think is just a remarkable and amazing thing, which is the rise of namespaces. We're seeing more and more of these namespaces arise, so that scientists who disagree about what to call something, in fact, what the taxonomy of it should be, it's not just a name thing, but where it fits in the taxonomy that's driving it, they don't have to agree. They can make progress without ever resolving the probably irresolvable question of what the right taxonomy is. Well, we don't know. There are reasons to do it this way. Doesn't matter. At least we know we're all pointing at that thing and talking about that thing, or talking about that gene. The rise of namespaces have always been with us. The rise of them explicitly as a tool for managing difference is quite remarkable, is amazing, and actually fills me with hope. So here's something that doesn't fill me with hope, because I don't want to be too hopeful. I don't want to be too rosy about this at all. There is a view of the net which I personally have held and still sort of like, because I'm an optimist. I'm a depressed optimist, but I'm an optimist, is that the net connects all these people across the world, all these differences. It's so amazing, and we'll all be talking with people who are unlike us and having. Yeah, okay, the net does consist of people who are vastly unlike, but there's some. So this is a long discussion. I'm going to do very briefly. There's some good reason to think that. Yeah, but this is who we hang out with. So they're there, but human beings seem to have a preference for those who are like us, homophily, if you will. I think there are good reasons for homophily, especially around the nature of conversation. I think there are some issues that those who talk about echo chambers are wrong about in how they think about what the nature and social role of conversations is. But this is the echo chamber argument. Its most famous proponent is Cass Sunstein. He's currently in the Obama White House, a law professor, the most cited American law professor in history, I believe, in a couple of books, Republic.com, for example. And it's a powerful case, in part because we all know to some degree that this happens, that we do hang out with people who are like us, and that, in fact, it's very hard to engage with people who are unlike us. How many of you have ever sat down with a neo-Nazi to have a good, honest, open discussion? In which you are, because open discussion means that you're as open to change, to become a neo-Nazi as you hope he, or occasionally she, is to becoming a rational, caring human being. Doesn't happen. I'm a Jew. I'm never going to have that conversation. Don't want to have it. And the notion that the two of us could sit down, and this is what conversation really is. It's when the Jew and the neo-Nazi sit down and they're both open to changing sides. It's a ridiculous notion. It makes no sense at all. Nevertheless, there is something to worry about in the echo chamber argument, because humans do seem to have a tendency to stay within our comfort zone, to stay within our own little igloo. For some reason, I always think of echo chambers as igloos, which I don't think is really what the original metaphor was about, but in any case. So I want to come back to this very briefly at the end when talking about DPLA. Third thing that changes is we have an idea about how knowledge goes together. in long chains, right? So, and that's coming apart too, for better and for worse. So in the West, the idea of the right way to chain knowledge together is preferably you do it in deductive argument. You get A and B, you have to believe C if you believe A and B. There's no question about it. So that's the perfect sort of chain. And so we like to build, and we think knowledge, in fact, should consist of us filling in the links of this chain of ideas and evidence and argument so that we go from A to Z. In fact, that's what we do in books typically. Not fiction, but we make an argument, we try to support it and get to the end, bring the reader along the way. So I am not saying that books are going to go away. I'm not saying that Origin of Species is going to, if Darwin were alive today, he would have tweeted the whole thing. I don't think he would have, but I am saying that I think many of us already agree with this, that the cultural role of books is becoming diminished. Long-form works, in particular, is what I have in mind. Books that make an argument and carry all the way through. So I want to give 3 quick reasons why this may be happening. 3 problems with long-form argument that were masked when all that we had was paper. So the first is that this is Origin of Species. I take this as one of the greatest examples of long-form argument ever, just really magnificent work. If you look at it, the argument itself is in the first 5 chapters, and then we get 6 chapters of Darwin dealing with objections. And many of the objections, because Darwin was a very social person, he had lots of correspondence, many of the objections were ones that he had dealt with from real people, and some of them were things he made up, sitting alone, finally writing his book, and he's sitting there thinking of all the terrible, awful arguments that could be brought to bear against him by nameless people. This is a little fugue state that authors go into, in which they sit and they try to imagine everything bad that could be said, every attack. It's a combative mode, and then you anticipate them and you put them in, because that's what you had to do with paper. It's private until you publish, and then it's public. It's a sort of, you have to do it, but it's a crazy thing. It's a little time in which you imagine only the worst. And of course, you can't imagine all of the worst, because the world has many people in it, and they're going to come up with stuff you didn't anticipate. But that's what you had to do because you were publishing on paper. Second problem with long form is that you are trying to get your reader from A to Z, and it's a very big world out there. And so this is like taking people on a tour through a rich landscape. There's so many other things that you could talk about, but you have to have the discipline for the sake of your readers, and primarily to get the whole thing within one volume, that you have to keep them on the path. You cannot digress to see all the interesting sites and talk about everything in the field. And so in some ways, long-form argument just isn't long enough. It requires too close hewing to the path that you want your readers to come along. And the third problem is that, with long form, is that it generally doesn't work. You're trying to get your readers to Z, and frequently they get off around B, C, or D. They're reading your work and they say, it's interesting, but to get all the way to that conclusion rarely happens. And one of the things that perhaps we can talk about is examples where people do get all the way to the end. I think Origin of Species is one. There's a Peter Singer book on animal rights that I got all the way to Z on, and there are some others as well, but it's pretty rare. If you're reading Critique of Pure Reason, which was one of the great A to Z long-form works, nobody gets to Z anymore. If you're lucky if you may get to B, you may read it all the way through because it tells you interesting things about the time and the history of philosophy, but nobody comes out of it. Very few people come out of it all the way at Z. So what is the opposite of long-form thought? It's not really short-form thought, it's really web-form thought. So imagine if Darwin were alive. I don't think he'd be tweeting it, but I assume that he would be posting along the way. And as posting from the Beagle, his blog from the Beagle even. I noticed there's a discrepancy in the beaks of finches today. Darwin might have figured it out sooner, somebody else might have figured it out sooner, but in any case, the conversation would have started and continued as the people who objected, who supported, all pitched in. Darwin may or may not have replied, but other people would have replied instead. It would have spread out through the culture all the way to travel agents who were booking tours to the Galapagos. It would have been a web of knowledge, which would have more value than Origin of Species by itself. Origin of Species, and Darwin may well have written, even in this world, this webby world, may have written a long-form work, Origin of Species. I hope that he would have. but it would have been put on the web, and it would have been commented on the web. And that web of engagement has even more value than the work by itself. I want to give you another example of this that comes from Michael Nielsen, who has a book that came out last week called Reinventing Discovery. And I heard him talk, so I'm going to take his example. He's a scientist. He's a quantum guy. So his example was if in fact the Large Hadron Collider comes up with results and they discover the Higgs Boson, yay! We finally did it, it's real. There is no peer review group in the world that would be able to evaluate this claim. The knowledge of it comes from such a complex network of people and equipment that there is, and fields, everything from quantum mechanics to statistical studies, that there is no single person or even team that reasonably could evaluate it. So we will be confident, and we should be confident if this happens, that it's real, but the knowledge to a large and real extent exists in this network of people and machines. It is not a fact that, in the old sense, a brick-like fact that you can take out and look at and say, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so I want to, as a semi-practical case, just apply some of this to the DPLA. And I'm going to be very quick and sketchy because I don't know. I'm making stuff up. So these, pardon me, these are the characteristics that we've looked at. So knowledge becomes very, 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 very big, which argues for a type of inclusionism for the DPLA. But this actually, when in doubt, included. But this raises a question. I can't remember who asked this question. If somebody here knows, could you call out? The question was, how is Diplo going to be different from the web? Well, you got a web full of stuff. So how is Diplo going to be different? Does anybody remember who that was? Was it you? Yeah. Excellent. You want to put it right? I'm sure I mangled you. No, that was it. Yeah, it's a really, really good question. Because, we have a web, we have ways of finding things. What's going to be different? And so that question itself suggests that a type of curation is necessary, and that I'm actually perfectly fine with that. But also raises the question of whether whether we want the material in Diplo to be everything or only things that are library quality, that have some degree of certainty and safety for us, whether it's safety in making our judgments or safety for our children or whatever. And the question, I think that resolves to, do we want to exclude things based upon quality, or do we want to use our metadata in order to indicate the quality so that people can make judgments? And the argument for themselves, the argument in favor of the latter, and there are obvious arguments in favor of the former, is what happens at data.gov, where the first tab that you see is for raw data, that they would rather get it in raw so long as the user understands through the magic of metadata that this is raw data. It's better to have it there so people can work with it than not to have it there, to make that preemptive decision. Second characteristic is messiness. So obviously we need lots and lots and lots of metadata. This includes, of course, I assume, metadata that comes from the explicit actions of users who are tagging and rating and all the rest of the stuff, and implicit metadata left by users as they traverse the system, as long as its privacy concerns are addressed. That's in parentheses, but it's a really big parenthesis. Which also will enable there to be lots of orders, lots of ways of putting pieces together, lots of collections within the collections that address individual needs. And that seems to me to be unalloyed goodness, to have many, many orders, which also suggests that we want an open platform so that the ordering of stuff can be done outside of the DPLA. An open platform in which at least the metadata is openly available, if not the content. There are licensing issues, obviously, for content. Unchained, well, okay, so this for me suggests that Diplo should think of itself not so much as a set of collections, which it will undoubtedly be, but also a collection of collections. Sorry, not just a collection of collections, but a network of collections. Thinking of it as a network allows us to think of it in terms across all of the boundaries, in which the value comes from the linking among pieces, even on top of the value of the individual pieces and individual collections. This is important. Well, I'll get to that in a second. And finally, unsettled. So this is something, this will not be new, but I think there's maybe a difference in emphasis. So let's imagine we have a Diplo that is full of stuff and it's well marked up with metadata and user metadata and it's all great. Multiple collections, multiple layers and orders, wonderful. We still have the homophily problem. We still have the problem that people are going to want to stick with what they're comfortable with. And it certainly is a traditional role of librarians to steer people to authoritative sources. But as we all in this room know, I think, unless I'm wrong, the basic idea of authority is changing as well. That's what filtering is about. Authority is a type of metadata, and as we come up with new ways of filtering and social filtering, authority itself is changing. And so librarians still need to be guides to authoritative, useful sources, more so than ever. But what I want to suggest is that given the increase in the opportunity for us to build an echo chamber in which we sit comfortably, perhaps it will be increasingly the role of librarians to steer us not just to the safe and authoritative sources, but to the sources with which we disagree. That librarians as guides to differences, it seems to me, will be an increasingly valuable role, in addition to everything else that librarians do. And so I'm hoping that the DPLA views itself first and foremost as an enabler of networks. Networks of works, networks of people. Because the way that works matter to us is not simply you discovering a poet you hadn't heard of and reading her and being moved by her. That's wonderful, that's great. But culture really advances and is in fact constructed out of you sharing that with somebody else. You pointing somebody else to it, you explaining why you've got to read her, she's amazing in the following ways, and then discussing with others why that matters, and taking her works, her words, and adding them to, without even knowing it, having them become part of how you see the world and how you express the world, which is why, I got an email yesterday asking from an author saying, I'd like to quote 3 separate lines from something you wrote 11 years ago, and please sign here and give me permission. It drives me freaking crazy. That we're at the point where a single sentence, their publisher is telling them, make sure that the author gives you explicit permission. That kills culture. It kills culture because culture is made by people taking up somebody else's words and using them without attribution because it's become part of their world. That is a network effect. That's something we can do with networks now. We can connect people to works. We can connect works together through the marvels of linked open data and all the semantic work that we're doing. But we can also, and I hope Diplo takes this very seriously, we can now connect people to people around works and spread culture and build it more than we ever could before. And that's what I take as being the genuine role of the DPLA. Thank you. We have time for questions.